In this video, you'll be learning about this topic.
So we were going to talk about this a little bit later, but I'm going to bump it up because I think it would be naturally how a person who's not intimately familiar with a lot of the arguments and counter arguments with Bitcoin, what they're telling themselves or what they're asking themselves right now is the government's never going to allow this to step in and replace fiat currencies as we know them today. So how do you respond to a person who just comes to the table with that argument? Because I know I've heard it a million times. I'm sure you've heard it a million times. How do you respond to that person?
Yeah, it is, I think, without a doubt, the most common arm's length way to write off Bitcoin, right? If you've just heard about it, but you haven't looked into it, you just think, oh, clearly governments are never going to let that happen. In the US, we actually have a Supreme Court case precedent for open source software like Bitcoin. And I would encourage listeners to go look at the PGP case study. This was in the late 90s. The government was attempting to classify PGP, which is a pretty good privacy technology, that was being exported abroad. They were trying to classify it as munitions such that they could restrict its exportation. Trying to classify it as a weapon, essentially, so they could control its importing and exporting. And I'll gloss over the details of the case. There's some back and forth, but the case took a turning point when the plaintiff, I guess the defendant actually, the one representing PGP, actually printed out the entirety of PGP's source code and presented that as physical evidence. So they said, this is PGP. How do you outlaw this? This is the whole thing, all the source code, 100% of the software that we're trying to classify as a weapon or munitions is in this paper. It is speech written on this paper. And in that moment, the Supreme Court declared that PGP was protected under the First Amendment here in the United States, which is the freedom of speech. So we have Supreme Court case precedent that open source software is protected under the most important constitutional amendment in the US, which is the freedom of speech. So that's first, right? You would have to overturn the First Amendment to outlaw Bitcoin. And if you didn't, you'd have this irreconcilable difference in the body of the rule of law. Even if they did that, even if you overturn freedom of speech, outlaw Bitcoin, the ban itself is virtually unenforceable. Right? Bitcoin is just this lightweight software client running all over the world. There's no way to tell who's running it and who's not. You could try and target some of the mining operations, but we've seen this attempted in China. Miners just move, right? These little rigs are small, modular design things. You put them in a box, you ship them elsewhere, you plug them back in, you're going again. So it's a very elusive network to try and pin down, right? There is no central authority. There's no office, there's no CEO. All of these things that governments have become very adept at zeroing in on and shutting down, Bitcoin doesn't have any of those attack vectors on itself. And there's another thing that's interesting. There's a good analogy there. And this is a great analogous question for thinking about how you would shut down Bitcoin is, how would one shut down the internet everywhere, worldwide, forever, right? Like you can censor inputs and outputs in your own little jurisdiction, as countries tend to do, but that is not enough to stop Bitcoin, right? You would have to literally shut the whole thing down. And so long as even one computer with a node survives, then the whole thing replicates itself again globally.
Yeah.
So it's very anti-fragile in that sense, right? There's no single attack point, and it can be the entirety of Bitcoin is represented on every piece of node software in the world.
What do you say to the person that says, well, the government's just going to go after the exchanges. They're going to shut down the exchanges. And although it can continue to exist, it's just going to snuff out the flame that exists that's there.
We have a good precedent of this in China. China has actually done this a number of times. They've shut down exchanges. One interesting side effect of this is that it actually restricted the selling of Bitcoin in China, which if you restrict the selling, people are still buying globally, the price increased.
Yeah.
And if the price of Bitcoin increases, the network becomes more secure, it draws in more participants. So it didn't really have a consequential effect on Bitcoin itself. But you're absolutely right. Governments can target centralized exchanges and shut them down. This encourages, jumping back to the jurisdictional arbitrage play, if you're a government that shuts down exchanges, you've actually increased the incentive for other governments to then pick up that business, right? Because these are tax-paying entities. So there is an incentive to want to play friendly with Bitcoin. And if you look at what happened with the internet, the US took this do not harm approach, right? Just let the free market experiment figure itself out and see what happens. And we've had an unprecedented economic boom in the wake of that. So I think governments too don't want to miss the next big thing. And, frankly, I think every day that passes, Bitcoin has proven itself more and more as the next big thing on the digital landscape.
When I talked with Caitlin Long and I was asking her a pretty similar question to what I was asking you, her response was, Preston, I'm dealing with this every single day, trying to stand up her Avanti Bank and all that. She says, everything that I'm seeing from a legal standpoint and from the government stepping in and potentially stopping all of this is the exact opposite. She says, I'm seeing people, going out of their way in order to be able to capture where this is all going in state laws specifically. And I think it's really interesting there, what she's seeing out in Wyoming, which is they're really trying to be the Delaware of attracting more business into the state through Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, but they're laying all the foundation and all the legal framework for that to be the keystone of states to be able to do this.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And it is an indication of how Bitcoin actually, it emerged into the world, it bootstrapped itself by incentivizing others to adopt it and use it, right? Mm-hmm. And it plays out at every level. It plays out individual level, the corporate level, and even the nation state level, such that you're more economically harmed by trying to ignore it or resist it than you are just adopting it and holding it. So it reshapes the analogy I like to give here is money actually reshapes people's perception on the world. It reshapes the way we see the world. The table that this laptop is resting on right now, that I'm using to do this show with you, is a tool to me, right? It's providing a service to me. If I took a $100 bill and I gave it to someone and told them to jump over this table, it would just as quickly become an obstacle to that guy, right? So money is actually reshaping the way we see the world. And I think with Bitcoin, you can resist it and fight it and all these other things. But as you start to see that a lot of these attack vectors are futile, that you become just more willing to just hold it. It's such an energy efficient strategy to just hold some as even an insurance policy in case it catches on, right? And that realization is dawning on more and more people and organizations and even governmental entities by the day. So it's interesting how it reshapes. You would think that a central bank has a huge incentive, for instance, to resist Bitcoin, right? It's an existential threat to the central banking business model. But what is their appropriate response? You would think it would be to attack or try to shut it down. But when you see that these vectors don't necessarily work, what's your next best bet? It's to hold some as an insurance policy, right? If I have a 0.1% hypothesis that this thing might play out and my business model is done, then I need to hold 0.1% of my assets in Bitcoin as a perfect hedge against its success.
It's the same as a company that has a competitor that's just kicking their butt. And so then they just start buying some of their publicly traded shares and stacking them on their own balance sheet. If I can't beat them, I got to join them or start to own them somehow.
You're absolutely right. Companies acqui-hire and acquire their competitors all the time. The difference with Bitcoin is that no matter how much you acquire, you can't change it, right? It's just this perfectly scarce money that no one can really do anything about other than make it more valuable, right? By acquiring it, you're actually increasing its market capitalization.
Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on the next podcast episode and new investing resources.
What are your takeaways and thoughts on this discussion? Let us know in the comments section below.